name is Daniel, and this is the Engineering Success Podcast, episode 54. Thank you so much for listening. This episode was filmed on December 11th, 2023. Yeah, I'm ahead. I don't know what day you're listening to it, but it's definitely going to be after December 11th. It's really cool. We actually have a backlog of 2 interviews. So I hope you enjoyed our last interview with Michaela, because I know that you're also going to enjoy this interview with our guest, Steve. But before I give a pitch to Steve, let's give a shout out to our tier supporters of the episode. Thank you so much to Leroy Jenkins and John Ott for your support of the podcast. You too can become a top tier supporter of the podcast, either through Patreon or through Spotify for podcasters. Info in the description box down below. The top tier supporters get a shout out at the beginning of every single episode of the podcast, just to express my gratitude. Those are the people that keep the lights on here at the Engineering Success Podcast. I use that money to fund everything from our web domain, which is where our website is at www.engringsuccess.com, engineeringsuccess.com with an ENGR, spell engineer. And then we also have an email address where you can contact me if you're interested in showing up on the podcast and sharing your career journey as a graduated engineer. Daniel at engringsuccess.com, Daniel at engineeringsuccess.com. Just shoot me an email. Let me know, hey, Daniel, I want to be a guest. And I'll bring you on and you can share your story. Also, yeah, lots of good things going on the podcast. I also just found a new website called podcast..Mr that I'm going to be using to find even more guests. I have 8 or 9 more people that are interested in being guests of the podcast. So really good things going on, really cool stories. So our guest today is Steve Check. He is an entrepreneur, but he started out as an entrepreneur in the world of finance, but his career actually started out, just like this podcast says, in engineering. So, really cool journey that Steve has had in his career, and I'm really excited for you to listen to this episode of the podcast. So, without any further ado, let's go over there. Today, I'm honored to welcome Steve Check to the podcast. Steve holds a Bachelor's of Science in Electrical Engineering from Iowa State and a Master's in Engineering from the University of California, Irvine. He founded Check Capital Management in 1987, and as their Chief Investment Officer, he is responsible for their overall investment policy and portfolio management. Now, he was formerly educated as an engineer, and that is really interesting to me, and why I brought him onto the podcast, because we're all about learning about interesting engineering careers. But his coursework in accounting and his passion for investing drove him to a career in finance. He thoroughly studied great investors such as Benjamin Graham, Warren Buffett, Charlie Munger, etc., and he learned not only their techniques but the underlying mindset that they have, and he has transferred their success into the success of his own firm. As a member of the CFA Institute, he is also the past president of the CFA Society of Orange County, and I am so grateful to have Steve on the podcast today. Steve, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. And how are you?
I am blessed. What did you do today, Steve?
Actually, I had an eye doctor appointment and a regular doctor appointment, so I've been off on doctor appointments.
Yeah, that's what comes with running your own business, right? You get to control your schedule. I'll be honest, I sat in an office and sat in a bunch of meetings today that were for other stakeholders that make a lot of decisions that impact me. So maybe not the same type of day that you had.
Well, it all went well, so I'm happy. I'm happy to be here with you.
Good. Yeah, and I'm glad that you can see well and that you can see me and also that you can talk well, and we're going to have a great conversation today about you and your career. So, how did you decide that you were interested in engineering? Why did you study engineering, Steve?
Well, I like math and science, and scored well on those kind of tests, in high school. And it also came from the fact that my father was an engineer at IBM, and he kind of gave me the advice that and I was kind of torn between whether I wanted to be an engineering major, to be honest, or when I went to college, or to be a business major. And he said, you know what? You can go to college as an engineering major and switch to business, but you can't go as a business major and switch to engineering. So that made a lot of sense to me, and that's what kind of pushed me probably in the direction of pursuing an engineering major.
It's interesting that you say that because I actually had the exact same advice from my parents. My parents were like, "Man, do you really want to study business? What are you going to do with the business degree? You can do anything that you want to do with a business degree, with an engineering degree." So then you did it. You went to Iowa State. Why Iowa State?
Well, actually, I went my freshman year to University of Portland, and I was from Minnesota. I went to the University of Portland. I had really a scholarship to be an engineering major, but I had never been in Oregon before, going, arriving there to go to college. And when I got to Portland, while Portland's a beautiful city, it's beautiful because it rains out about 4 or 5 days a week, at least during the school year. And after one season, I guess we could call it, of that, I decided that I wanted to transfer back a little bit closer to home. And Iowa State is known as a very good engineering college back in the Midwest.
It is. It is a phenomenal engineering college back in the Midwest. I have some friends that went there that were engineers. I interned with a couple Iowa State engineers, and it is a phenomenal school. So, was the reason why you transferred there, was it a combination of the location and the prestige of the program? Were there certain things that you were looking for in the program whenever you were picking out which one to transfer to?
You know how it works when you're that young. Is A good friend of mine was going there that next year. I said, you know what? It
Yeah.
wasn't really any more sophisticated than that. And it was in a college town. Before I picked Portland, the one other college I had really considered strongly was University of Wisconsin at Madison, and that would have been a really fun place to go for sure. But it was a little bit bigger city, and I liked the idea of kind of a college town, which Iowa State presented.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, I'll say though, University of Wisconsin Madison maybe also difficult on the weather, maybe not as nice as Iowa State, or is it about the same?
Oh, I think they're both not too well. I mean, if you have all 4 seasons, so you're definitely going to have cold weather in the winter at either place.
Yeah, and I can thank the University of Wisconsin Madison for having horrific weather in the winter for my parents meeting one another. My mom, she moved to the U.S. from Hong Kong, and when she came to visit universities to tour, she toured University of Wisconsin Madison in the summer. And as you can imagine, it is absolutely gorgeous up there in the summer. And being from a relatively humid and hot climate in Hong Kong, she thought that was a wonderful. She didn't last 1 year. Within 1 year, she transferred to the University of Texas, and she's like, "I'm out of here." And then, long story short, eventually, a few years later, well, more than a few years later, my parents met in Texas. So, yeah, that's a good factor. And I've heard of worse reasons for people choosing to a college. I've heard of people following girlfriends, boyfriends, and then breaking up within first semester. So, having a friend there and a great engineering school is a perfectly valid reason for choosing Iowa State. I understand that. So, what kind of student were you at Iowa State? Were you pretty studious? What kind of grades did you have as an engineering student?
Well, I always felt like I was an above average student, and I probably really was, but I always felt like there were certainly other students that were quite a bit smarter. But I did become, I do remember now, the kind of the class representative both in my junior and senior year for the IEEE Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineering. And I did also get a scholarship to, really, it paid for my college education, both my junior and senior years, by Caterpillar Tractor Company. They had a really great scholarship program, and I was selected to be the student, at least from Iowa State, for my class.
That's phenomenal. So was that something that was always the case for you? Were you just as good of a student in high school, or was it one of those things where you just turned it on in college and you had one of those realization moments?
Well, it wasn't until quite a bit later that my mom put together a little book on my life, almost, I guess you could say, and she put my report card in there from high school, and I was about 20th out of like 600 in my class, so I
It's
guess I was
always, yeah.
high. But
Yeah, so you're always a good
I never
student.
considered myself that high, but it was like, in retrospect, it was a pretty high ranking.
Yeah. And it's interesting that it was consistent for you because, you hear a lot of stories, right, where people they're a good student in high school and then they burn out when they get to college because they reach that plateau and then they burn out and then they have to turn it back on. But it goes to show that somebody can be a consistently good student from high school and then take the momentum from high school into college. Now, you said that you were a member of IEEE and you were the president. I was also a member of IEEE, and I also competed in my local ethics competition as an IEEE member while studying mechanical engineering. Interesting story there. Maybe if we have time, we'll dig into that. But what kind of involvements were the most important involvements for you as a student? Was it mainly IEEE, or were there other things that you got to take part in?
I ended up being, as far as the IEEE part, I ended up being really the student representative for my class. I did meet with the faculty and try to help shape the curriculum, I guess you could say, so I was really the, like student government, if you would call it that, but just for, just with the engineering college and just really specifically the electrical engineering college. So trying to get professors to do things that they didn't really like to do and pressuring them from a student's point of view, I guess was kind of my goal.
Yeah. I imagine that that was actually probably a pretty valuable experience when you look back on it, on thinking about business relationships and how that all works. I'm sure that was the first of many rounds of negotiations that you've had in your career. So, okay, you did Iowa State and then you graduated. You had internships, and we can talk about those in a minute. But then you decided to pursue a master's. Why a master's? And I believe it was in electrical engineering. Why did you take the next step further into your engineering degree? At this point, did you still have aspirations of working as a design engineer for your career, or was that finance thing creeping in the back of your mind while you were still doing this?
Well, it actually kind of swings back to the weather again, believe it or not. Uh, when I was a freshman again at the University of Portland for spring break, I went to Southern California, and the weather in Southern California is unbeatable, and that stayed in the back of my mind when I was graduating from Iowa State, and wasn't 100% sure what I wanted to do, and decided to pursue a master's degree as we talked about, and in Southern California. So UC, University of California, Irvine. So that's what kind of really brought me there. And I was still, like I said, still kind of exploring how much I really liked engineering or not.
Makes sense. So then you got the master's. Did you pick a specific specialty or concentration within electrical engineering?
Yeah, I did. It was really, I focused on digital signal processing.
Okay. Makes sense, right? You went to work for IBM, right? And was that kind of related?
No, I wouldn't say it was related. I just, when I got to University of California, Irvine, and they had to kind of specialize a little bit. I really did find the kind of the computer programming and the modeling interesting. And so, and then the professor that was really the lead professor in that area at University of California, Irvine was kind of world renowned, I think, and kind of led me into that direction.
Yeah, that makes sense. And so looking back on that experience, knowing now where your career has taken you, do you are you happy about the way that you handled your education from going from two engineering degrees? Are you do you value that experience?
Well, very much so. I mean, very
Yeah.
much so. Like we think we talked about just a little bit ago, as an engineer background, you have the confidence you feel that you can really go into anything
Yeah.
and talk to anybody. And we all, as engineers, between us engineers, we always felt we were the smartest guys at school, right?
Yes.
So we always felt very confident as engineering majors in school, and so it really gave me, in my background now in digital signal processing, when I ultimately, we're going to talk about the fact that I got into the stock market. When I looked at the stock market, it looked like a bunch of random signals that I thought some digital signal processing filtering could work very well with.
That makes sense. I'm excited to talk about that. So would you say that there was a particular class then that ended up being the most valuable class for your career that you look back on, and you value the most?
Well, probably noise cancellation kind of software, and along those lines of digital signal processing. So trying to, again, take a random signal and predict the future of that random signal, and then apply that to the stock markets, where I ultimately went with it.
That's exciting. So let's talk about that career. Maybe not in the stock market yet. We'll build up to that, right? We'll build into the stock market where we'll index our way into it. So your first that was a horrible pun. I'm going to be trying multiple puns,
Kind of
by the
got it
way,
though.
throughout the yeah. I'll be trying more throughout the way, and we'll see if I can get you. So your first experience working in the industry uh, was working for IBM. What was that job like, and what did you learn about the engineering industry and about yourself working for IBM?
So my IBM job was probably, I think, right after my freshman year of college, and it was really just, it was manual labor. I was putting together printed circuit boards and putting the kind of components in the circuit board that the automated machines, still at that time couldn't put in, through automation. So it was sitting at a desk all day with kind of a bright light type of thing, and putting pieces in a puzzle.
Did you like it?
No, I wouldn't say I really liked it. I realized that I wanted to do something that was, a little more using your mind than putting pieces into a puzzle.
Okay. So then did you get to use your mind a little bit more at your next internship with Caterpillar?
Yeah, now Caterpillar was a very interesting job, and because as I'm of the age, I'm 62 years old, where personal computers were just coming into the market, and putting automation in the market, and so I was able to do some really interesting things with learning with control systems and how to operate, the assembly line and automate all that, and Caterpillar was really right on the front edge of all that, so I learned a lot at that job.
Really? Were they doing that for industrial equipment that they were like putting like I guess operating computers into the equipment, or what were they doing?
Well, a lot of this actually had to do with actually just maintaining the facility. So just the control
Oh,
systems
wow.
around the facility. But I was working at the foundry that made the engine blocks for the big engines. But it was again controls around the air conditioning, the heating, and everything else that went into it.
Yeah, and was this all within close proximity to where you were going to school at the time, or did you have to make any kind of, I don't know, lifestyle changes to pursue the internships that you were pursuing while you were in school?
Well, the Caterpillar one was just actually over the summer between years of college. So
Okay.
so then they picked one student from most of the big Midwest engineering colleges, and as I said, I was picked from the Iowa State, and so we all ended up in Peoria, Illinois, at Caterpillar's headquarters, at least at the time, and we all worked there.
Yeah, that's a cool experience. And then after that, then you were in grad school and you started working for Hughes, which I believe is an aircraft manufacturing company. Is that correct?
Well, I think they made one aircraft. Howard Hughes made the
Okay.
Spruce Goose in World War II, but I, for some reason took that name. But I ended up in Southern California, and I got offered a job with satellites, which is now turned into, by the way, DirecTV, that particular division.
Okay.
But it was up in Los Angeles, and I had actually already moved to Orange County, just south of Los Angeles, and I liked Orange County better than Los Angeles. So instead of working at the satellite division, I ended up working ultimately at the integrated circuit division in Newport Beach, California.
Okay. And what were you doing there?
I was actually a circuit designer, and I was an analog circuit designer, which is kind of an interesting area of circuit design. But and we ended up making circuits really for different military applications in general that Hughes was working on throughout the company. So it was like
That's
kind of
cool.
their own in-house fab and integrated circuit design, facility.
That's cool. And so you're doing this and you've got your masters, or you're working on your masters, and you're working for this company, and you're doing some intense electrical engineering. Are you enjoying it, or what are you realizing about your relationship to engineering at this point?
Well, I was enjoying it. However, I wasn't really enjoying working for a huge company like Hughes Aircraft, which, by the way, was even a private company for most of the time I was there. It was owned by Hughes Medical Foundation, something that Howard Hughes set up in his life. And I don't know, I was a little bit more entrepreneurial than working at a big company like that, and where the best employees might got an 8% a year raise and the worst employees might got a 2% a year raise. And so I got a little itchy.
Yeah. And so where was that itch taking you at that point in time? What was brewing in the back of your mind as you were sitting and you were designing circuits?
Well, coming from the Midwest, I noticed that the people, at least from where I came from, the Midwest, which was Rochester, Minnesota, the people in Southern California were very entrepreneurial. They were always kind of looking to do other things, maybe make other money in other ways. And it was expensive. It was expensive relative to moving, than living in the Midwest. So I was kind of had my eyes open, and there used to be a channel on UHF channel 22, they called it here in Los Angeles, which was a real precursor to CNBC today, and it talked about the stock market all day, and I started watching that, and I kind of got hooked on it, I guess you could say.
Yeah. So you got hooked on the stock market, but you're still working for an engineering firm, or you're working as an engineer. So there has to be some moment where you realize, okay, I need to absolutely break out. So what was that moment that enabled you to break out and eventually start your own financial services company, or financial advising company, sorry.
Yeah, it was not an overnight process. I mean, I became aware of the stock market. I became aware of ways to maybe invest in stocks. I tried to apply, as I said, kind of my engineering background, my software writing skills to track stocks. And next thing you know, I started showing other engineers at work, what I thought was a good way to invest. And before long, I was managing money for other engineers. So my first 10 clients as a registered investment advisor or an asset manager were actually engineer colleagues. I started managing accounts for them.
Wow. So you were working and you actually got your certification to be a registered investment advisor, and then you picked up clients. Were you also still working as an engineer while you were advising them and managing their finances?
Yeah, I was. Really, my first official year in business was 1987, and at the end of 1987, there was this thing called the stock market crash, and and people were not that interested in the stock market at the end of 1987. So rather than quit my job, my kind of secure engineering job, and pursue this investment advisory business full time, I waited another year. So there was 2 years of overlap, 1987 and 1988, where I was really doing both, working full time as an engineer, but kind of at night thinking of ways to invest.
How was that managing that balance between the two houses that kind of ran your life? Was it a pretty manageable balance, or were you pretty taxed in that process?
It was pretty manageable. I kind of felt. I mean, really, the stock market thing was just my big hobby. It was just, and I
Yeah.
really had a passion for that. And then I also realized that that was fulfilling that entrepreneurial bent. Every time you had a new client, you kind of gave yourself a little raise, and ultimately, I could almost hardly wait to leave engineering and actually pursue the financial advising, if you will, or investment advisory business full time.
Yeah. Was there a specific moment that you remember whenever you realized to yourself, man, I can do this. I can quit my job.
People probably look back at me, and I might even look back at me and think I was kind of crazy to do it too, because I was, I guess, around 26 or 27 years old. But when you're 26 or 27, you probably think you can do almost anything. And it was, I just said to myself, if I quit and get one new client a week or something of that sort, I can make a living at this. So originally, like a lot of people, I worked out of my home for my first year or two,
Yeah.
and worked on building up the business. And also kind of a key was I kind of figured out, I just can't go out there maybe and find clients completely cold. I was able to work out a relationship with a discount stock brokerage firm where they help refer clients my way. And I would give presentations on how I thought we could invest, and was a very low key way of just really educating about how to invest. And if it made sense, then I got clients through that.
Yeah. That makes a lot of sense. And so you're doing this all by yourself for how long was it that you were doing this by yourself before you hired your
Oh,
first employee?
yeah, I think my first employee came like 3 or 4 years later,
Yeah.
3 or 4 years into it. Yeah.
And what was the thing that you hired your first employee to do?
Well, I think it was actually my wife who I took out of her job, start doing some of the bookkeeping here, at the house, and keeping track of the client portfolios with the software that was just coming out to do that. So this was very front edge, by the way, the whole investment advisory industry, which is now a very big industry, but
Yeah.
in the late 1980s, it was in its infancy. And so the software around that industry, and the firms like Charles Schwab and Fidelity, which have a big business of partnering with investment advisors, they were just looking at going into that business back at
Yeah.
that time. Schwab was actually the first, and they started it in the late 1980s.
Yeah. And I mean, having started in 1987, you've seen a lot of things happen in the industry and the economy and everything like that. And you've also seen your business grow substantially since obviously 1987. How many employees do you have now?
Well, the number of employees is still relatively small. We have like
Yeah.
11 or 12 employees, but
Okay.
we do manage about $1.7 billion, which is quite a bit of money for
Yeah.
even a 10 or 12 person employee firm.
Yeah. And so yeah, that give me a second to take that in. Yeah, that is a sizable amount of money. Were there any, I guess, pivotal or formative moments in the history of your business that stand out as the defining moments of your business that allowed it to become so successful to this point? Are there anything that you can reflect on?
Yeah, I think if I really had to go back to it, it was around about 3 or 4 years into the business, and I started charging our management fees in a way that's different than what you normally find in our industry. Most people in our industry charge usually 1% of the assets per year to manage the accounts. That's kind of the standard fee schedule. And the problem with that fee schedule, at least from a client's point of view, is that even if the account goes down or goes sideways, the money manager still made 1% of the assets as a management fee. And
Yep.
I decided that I wanted to not work that way, at least if I could. The SEC does have some rules around that, but we started offering, I could say almost but there's only like two or three of us. But I started offering a fee schedule that was based on 10% of the profits of the client's accounts billed once a year. So doing that around 1991, early in my career, I found a lot of clients that, hey, I'd like to find a money manager that only gets paid when he makes me money, and that was kind of a defining moment. And it's a real hard business move. I mean, if
Yeah.
you have a larger organization, you can't go a year or two without any revenues often, which could happen if you have a down year or two,
Yeah.
which you will have. But again, doing it, starting off fresh like that and starting off small and thinking along those lines, I was able to carry that through, and we still carry that through to this day. By far, the vast majority of our clients have hired us under that kind of a fee schedule.
That's impressive. And it, I mean, that requires a certain level, as you said, planning and foresight, and maybe also this your size of your organization contributes to that. But are there any insights that you learn from having to think long term like that and the way that you operate as a business and maybe communicating that to the people that work for you and work with you?
Yeah, you do need to keep it relatively lean and mean, just so
Yeah.
that if you do have a down year, and you do have to make sure that you have, reserves set aside, just like any retired person would do, and have reserves set aside for living expenses. We had to have reserves set aside for, let's say, operating expenses of the business.
Yeah, that makes sense. So we've talked a little bit about what you do and what your business does and what sets you guys apart. Have we missed anything about? I feel like we've just scratched the surface. So maybe why don't you give us a little bit more info about your business and what you guys do?
Well, ultimately, the software that I learned in engineering wasn't really that useful in the sense of predicting where the stocks were going to go. So it was a little humbling to find that out. But the software was very helpful in automating a business, that's for sure. But ultimately, I think, use kind of my engineering mindset and problem solving, mindset, and engineered my way into kind of the investment philosophy that we ultimately started using way back, let's say in the early 90s now. But what you should do is look for successful examples and try to figure out how they were successful. So what I mean by that is look for successful money managers and learn from their example. And fortunately for me, I became aware of Warren Buffett early on, meaning that not that many people knew about him in 1990, even though he had been around and managing money successfully very quietly for a long time, as of like around 1990. When I became aware of his investment philosophy, buying good quality, being patient, being disciplined, letting the market work for you, not against you, keeping your emotions in check, etc. All these kind of teachings that we all know of from Warren Buffett today was kind of kept under wraps back in that time. But when I became aware of that and employed that into our investment philosophy, that was another major turning point, I guess you could say.
Yeah, that makes sense. So what is your average? Do you have an average type of client? Is there a specific type of person that comes to you and works with you?
Yeah, I'd say an average client probably has about a $3 million net worth and has maybe about a million or $1.5 million under management with us.
Okay, makes sense. I'm almost there. Just kidding. Not quite there. I don't know if you can tell, but I'm like in my early 20s and I have a semi-successful podcast and an early career engineering job. So we're not quite there yet, but eventually I'll be there. And I'll be
When I
giving you a
was
call.
when I was only about 10 years or so older than you, I went to an annual meeting with Warren Buffett's partner, Charlie Munger, and he looked out in the crowd and said, you know what? Anybody that's in this meeting, I think, is going to be probably pretty successful someday. And I'm going to look out at you and say, I feel the same way. So I think you got a great future ahead of you.
Thanks so much, Steve. Speaking of future, so we have a lot of my audience is mostly kids in high school that are dreaming of becoming an engineer, or early college engineers that are trying to make it through finals right now, or people that are just starting in their career of engineering, what advice would you give to somebody that's considering pursuing an engineering degree?
Keep pursuing it.
Yeah.
I gave that same advice to my son, who did then graduate and get both a bachelor's and a master's degree in civil engineering, and actually just loves it. So he is
Yeah.
now the traffic engineer for a Southern California city here. But I run into another engineering major that, and I went to lunch with him here about a year or two ago, and I introduced him to, Charlie Munger and Warren Buffett and this type of thing. And he's been wanting to quit college ever since, almost, and switch to the business thing. I says, no, 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 don't do that. Stay, get your engineering major for sure, and then take that wherever it takes you. It'll take you a lot of places. So stay
Yeah.
with the engineering major and stay with the education and use that as your foundation to go wherever you want to go.
Yeah. So it's so funny because my next question is what would you say to an engineer that has that passion for a career in business or beyond traditional design engineering? You say continue pursuing the engineering degree. A lot of engineers feel like maybe that they'd be wasting their engineering degree by pursuing a field beyond that. And honestly, that's something that I grappled with for the longest time. I mostly I work in contracts now. Most of my time is spent pouring through engineering contracts and engineering rates and negotiating engineering terms. But there was a period of time when I was like, oh, this is the direction I'm going. It's more operational, business side, not design. Am I okay with this? You're a great example of somebody that said, well, yes, I value the engineering degree. I'm going to apply it. I'm going to use it, and I value it. And what would you say to somebody that is about to make that leap, or they're finding themselves kind of their careers just drifting towards away from design engineering, and they're having trouble kind of releasing that that fact that well, I spent all this time studying design engineering.
Well, I think you definitely have to follow your passion in life. So you're not going to be really all that great or even all that happy doing something just for a paycheck, if you will. So if you find yourself, in an engineering job that you don't like, find another engineering job, or, find a whole nother job altogether. And again, I guess I felt most guilty. I mean, I really have a lot of respect for engineers, and I think the world needs, for example, engineers more than they need money managers. So I felt kind of guilty taking all the resources that were put into my education with professors and all that, and saying I'm kind of I'm kind of pushing that aside to pursue, I think, a less worthy career, if you will, as a money manager. So. But I've been always just happy and fascinated, and never really felt this was even a job. And so I think if anyone can find that in their profession, that's ultimately the key.
Yeah, that's a beautiful sentiment, and I'll tell you, as somebody who works in an industry where we build a lot of things and we work with a lot of people that are trying to develop projects, the people that manage the money and that provide the financing are the people that enable a lot of amazing things to get built in our country. And I think that people that manage money and are that help make sure that there's good stewardship over money, helping people realize their life dreams and the stability and their goals for their setting up their security in life and the security of the people that they love that come after them. I think there's a lot of great value in that. And I hope, I know you feel it. I know that you feel it, and you've definitely gotten it at this point. So I want to say thank you for what you do. And thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I really appreciate you sharing your story. Did I miss anything in the journey?
No, I appreciate that wrap up. And again, in anything you do, do it the right way for the customer, and you'll feel pretty good about what you're doing too.
Thank you so much, Steve. And thank you so much for this coming on to this episode of the podcast.
You're welcome. I'm very happy to have done it.
Well, thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Engineering Success Podcast. The best way you can support the podcast is by liking, commenting, sharing down below, mainly commenting down below. If you want, you can give me a 5-star review on your favorite podcast provider, preferably Apple Podcasts. If you give me a 5-star review, I'll read it out at the beginning of the next episode of the podcast. It's a great way to support the podcast. And as always, thank you so much for listening to Engineering Success, and I'll catch you in the next one.
I'm miscommunicating. I just made a pilot, then they threw me on the stations. Now I'm not complaining. My thoughts get complicated, I cannot explain in layman's. Never losing focus because I ain't chasing payments. Still playing in the basement while I'm working on arrangements. They heard the kid in 50 countries, thank God that's amazing. But I'd rather thank Spotify, they put me on the station.